Good morning. I will be continuing stories from the classic fairy tales by Iona and Peter Opie. The next story is the history of Jack and the Giants. But before we get started, a little bit of history on the story. Jack the Giant Killer. Sir Francis Palgrave's pronouncement, generally attributed to Sir Walter Scott, that Jack, commonly called the Giant Killer, landed in England from the very same keels and warships which conveyed Hengist and Horsa and Ebba the Saxon, has often been echoed by the nursery historians. Certainly the tenor of Jack's tale and details of more than one of the tricks with which he outwits the giants have prototypes in northern mythology. In the prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, written about 1220, the giant Skrymir is as wary of Thor, his traveling companion as was Jack when staying the night with the Welsh giant. Before going to sleep, he makes a mound in his sleeping place, prudently, as it turns out, to represent his head. When Thor with his mighty hammer strikes, as he thinks, Skrymir's head, Skrymir, who is in fact Utgard Loki, the king of Utgard, inquires if a leaf has fallen from a tree. When Thor strikes again, Skrymir wonders whether an acorn has fallen. And when Thor strikes yet again, delivering the fiercest blow of which he is capable, so that the head of the hammer sinks into the handle, Skrymir complains only that a bird has dropped something on his face. A similar incident occurs in the Swedish tale of the herd boy and the giant. When the herd boy rests for the night in the giant's home, he takes the precaution of placing a milk churn in his bed, and himself hides behind the door. The next day the giant is astonished to see him alive and well. "I thought I struck thee dead with my club," is his morning greeting, and the pert lad replies, "I rather believe I felt in the night as if a flea had bitten me." In the same tale, the herd boy sits down with the giant to eat porridge, first tying a bag to his chest as Jack did, and he puts 2 spoonfuls of porridge in his bag for every spoonful he eats. When the giant asks how so small a person can eat so much, the lad confides that, when full, he slits his stomach so that he can eat as much again, and taking a knife, he rips open the bag so that the porridge pours out. The dolt of a giant, in fairy tales all giants are stupid, is entranced by the trick, takes a knife to his own stomach, and kills himself. This tale, it would seem, shares an ancestor with that of the Valiant Little Tailor, a story that in itself has wide distribution and was collected in Hesse by the Grimm brothers. In fact, it will be appreciated that in the domain of folklore, the bamboozling of giants, ogres, ghouls, griffins, dragons, the minotaur, and other fearsome creatures is so pleasant to the youthful imagination as to be of universal expression, particularly if the gratitude of a well-endowed maiden is to be the reward. Thus, worldwide analogues offer no surety of Jack's antiquity, any more than do his possession of a cloak of invisibility, cap of knowledge, shoes of swiftness, and sword of sharpness, all second-hand articles which he seems to have acquired from Tom Thumb or from northern mythology. That stories about giants, and man-eating giants in particular, were rife around British hearths in days of old is apparent enough. King Arthur's bloody encounter with a giant of St. Michael's Mount, the granite island fortress that may be still visited off the toe of Cornwall, is related both in Sir Thomas Malory's La Mort d'Arthur, printed by Caxton in 1485, and even earlier in Geoffrey of Monmouth's popular Historia Regum Britanniae, written in the 12th century in the Complaint of Scotland, published in 1549. One of the tales that the shepherds told was the tale of the giantess that ate quick men. In King Lear, written probably in 1605, Edgar mouthing snatches of old verse during his assumed madness, lets drop the lines, quote, Childe Rowland to the dark tower came, his word was still, Fie, foe, and fume, I smell the blood of a British man. Unquote. And 9 years before King Lear, Thomas Nash, in Have With You to Saffron Walden, not only showed that he too knew the giant's fulmination, but gave a warning that we ourselves perhaps should take to heart. Quote, Oh, 'tis a precious apothegmatical, there we go. Oh, 'tis a precious apothegmatical pendant, who will find matter enough to dilate a whole day of the first invention of fee, fa, foam, I smell the blood of an Englishman. End quote. Be this as it may, since the cant fable which associates a Childe Rowland with the giant's rhyme is almost certainly of modern composition, and possibly a hoax, it would seem safe to think that Shakespeare knew a tale of blood-sniffing giants, such as those who made sport for nimble Jack. The difficulty is that no mention of Jack the Giant Killer, or of Jack and the Beanstalk, has been found in 16th and 17th century literature. And although a strong tradition of magical giant-killing tales has been found among the hill folk of British stock in the southern Appalachians, no telling of the tale has been recorded in English oral tradition. The story of Jack the Giant Killer, as we know it, appears to consist of a number of classic anecdotes strung together by an astute publisher in the not-so-long ago. The earliest known edition, styled The History of Jack and the Giants, was issued in 2 parts. Only the second part seems to exist, or to have existed, for in keeping with its enchanted subject, the copy in the British Museum has vanished, but the record has it that it was printed by J. White of Newcastle in 1711, and that it contained, as its title page set forth, a full account of Jack's victorious conquests over the North Country giants, destroying the enchanted castle kept by Galligantus. One moment. Apologies. Let's see. The record has it that was printed by J. White of Newcastle in 1711, and that it contained, as its title page set forth, a full account of Jack's, quote, victorious conquests over the North Country giants, destroying the enchanted castle kept by Galligantus, dispersed the fiery griffins, put the conjurer to flight, and released not only many knights and ladies, but likewise a duke's daughter, to whom he was honorably married. End quote. The suggestion that this continuation of the tale, at least, had been first published only a few years earlier is difficult to confute. The History of Jack and the Giants does not seem to have been one of the series of chapbooks listed in the late 17th century. It does not occur, where it might be expected, in William Thackeray's catalogue of small books, the Ballads and Histories, produced for sale by Chapman about 1689. It has not been found in several lists examined of petty books published in the first years of the 18th century. Nor does Jack seem to have been one of the folk heroes in the popular repertoire of Robert Powell, the puppet showman, who was operating at this time in Covent Garden. On the other hand, Jack and the Giants is referred to in the Weekly Comedy, 22 January 1708, as being formerly printed in small octavio. Footnote, this reference occurs in dialogue, notable only for its facetiousness, in which a speaker is making play with a hypothetical situation, so that when he says formerly, he apparently refers not to the past, but to present reality. End footnote. And Nicholas Amherst, in the 10th number of Terrae Filius, February 1721, speaks of history professors who never read anything but Tom Thumb and Jack the Giant Killer. Indeed, it is apparent that as the 18th century grew older, Jack became a familiar character to all and sundry. A comitragical farce entitled Jack the Giant Killer was performed at the Haymarket in 1730. Make-believe letters from Jack the Giant Killer were a feature of A Little Pretty Pocket Book, 1744, the first book that John Newbery produced for the young. A political satire, probably by Henry Brooke, the last speech of John Good, vulgarly called Jack the Giant Queller, was published about 1745. Further, Henry Fielding, in the first chapter of Joseph Andrews, 1742, speaks of, quote, John the Great, who, by his brave and heroic actions against men of large and athletic bodies, obtained the glorious appellation of the Giant Killer, end quote. Dr. Johnson admitted to Mrs. Thrale that in an idle moment he had been reading Jack the Giant Killer and hazarded that so noble a narrative might rouse in him the soul of enterprise. Boswell declared that when a boy, he had much been entertained by Jack the Giant Killer, and when he was 23, he bought himself a new copy from the printer in Bow Churchyard, and William Cowper, born 1731, who was another who loved giant-killing Jack, commented on such a tale in his conversation, quote, A story in which nature humor reigns is often useful, always entertains, end quote. The test which follows is almost certainly that with which these literary giants were familiar 200 years ago. It comes from a chapbook edition published in Shrewsbury, the first part being printed by J. Eddowes, the second part by J. Cotton and J. Eddowes. John Cotton and Joshua Eddowes are known to have been in partnership, supplying cheap literature to hawkers from 1761 to 1765, and they may have been in business together before this, for Cotton, who seems to have died in 1765, had been in business in Shrewsbury since 1746, and Eddowes since 1749. Further, the text of their history of Jack and the Giants almost certainly derives, with little alteration, from a chapbook of the beginning of the century. The text is longer than that in the illustrated Metropolitan editions. The style is more archaic, and the wording of the subtitle of Part 2 is convincingly similar to that of John White's edition of 1711. And we're going to start with the story. One sec. Okay. The History of Jack and the Giants, Part the First. In the reign of King Arthur near the Land's End, footnote, Cornishmen continue to speak of the Land's End while the rest of the country refers to Land's End. End footnote. In the reign of King Arthur near the Land's End of England, namely the country of Cornwall, the county of Cornwall, there lived a wealthy farmer who had only one son, commonly known by the name of Jack the Giant Killer. He was brisk and of a lively, ready wit, so that whatever he could not perform by force and strength, he completed by ingenious wit and policy. Never was any person heard of that could worst him. Nay, the very learned many times he baffled by his cunning and sharp, ready inventions. For instance, when he was no more than 7 years of age, his father, the farmer, sent him into the field to look after the oxen, which were then feeding in a pleasant pasture. A country vicar, by chance one day coming across the fields, called to Jack and asked him several questions, in particular, "How many commandments are there?" Jack told him, "There were 9. The parson replied, "There are 10. "Nay," quoth Jack, "Mr. Parson, you are out. It's true there were 10, but you broke one with your maid Marjorie." The parson replied, "Thou art an arch wag, Jack." "Well, Mr. Parson," quoth Jack, "you have asked me one question, and I have answered it, and I beseech you, let me ask you another. Who made these oxen?" The parson replied, "God made them, child." "Now you are out again," quoth Jack, "for God made them bulls, but my father and his man Hobson made oxen of them." These were the witty answers of Jack. The parson, finding himself outwitted, trudged away, leaving Jack in a fit of laughter. In those days the Mount of Cornwall was kept by a huge and monstrous giant, 18 foot in height, and about 3 yards in compass, of a fierce and grim countenance, the terror of all the neighbouring towns and villages. His habitation was a cave in the midst of all the mount. Never would he suffer any living creature to inhabit near him. His feeding was upon other men's cattle, which often became his prey. For whensoever he wanted food, he would wade over the mainland, where he would furnish himself with whatever he found. For the people at his approach would forsake their habitations. Then he would seize upon their cows and oxen, of which he would make nothing to carry over on his back, 6 at a time. And as for their sheep and hogs, he would tie them around his waist like bandoliers. Footnote: Bandoliers are here the little cases, each containing a charge for the musket, which soldiers hung from their shoulder belt. End footnote. This he for many years had practiced, so that great part of the county of Cornwall was much impoverished by him. But one day Jack, coming to the town hall when the magistrates were sitting in consultation about this giant, he asked them what reward would they give to any person that should destroy him. They replied, he should have all the giant's treasure and recompense. Quoth Jack, then I myself will undertake the work. Jack, having undertaken the task, he furnishes himself with a horn, shovel, and a pickaxe, and over to the mount he goes in the beginning of a dark winter evening, where he fell to work, and before morning had digged a pit 22 feet deep, and almost as broad, covering the same over with long sticks and straw. Then, strowing a little of the mould upon it, it appeared like the plain ground. This done, Jack places himself on the contrary side of the pit, just about the dawning of the day, when putting his horn to his mouth he blew the same tantive, tantive, which unexpected noise roused the giant, who came running towards Jack, saying, You incorrigible villain, are you come here to disturb my rest? You shall pay dearly for this. Satisfaction I will have, and it shall be this. I will have you whole, and broil you for my breakfast. Which words were no sooner out of his mouth, but he tumbled headlong into the pit, whose heavy fall made the very foundation of the mount to shake. O giant, quoth Jack, where are you now? In faith you are gotten into Lob's Pound. Footnote. Lob's Pound was a popular name in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries for a prison, or any place of confinement. End footnote. Where are you now? In faith you are gotten into Lob's Pound, where I will plague you for your threatening words. What do you think now of broiling me for your breakfast? Will no other diet serve you but poor Jack? Thus, having tantalized the giant for a while, he took him such a considerable blow upon the crown of his head with his pickaxe that he tumbled down, and with a dreadful groan died. This done, Jack threw the earth in upon him, and so buried him. And then, going and searching his cave, he found much treasure. Now when the magistrates which employed him heard the work was over, they sent for him, declaring that he should henceforth be called Jack the Giant Killer, and in honour thereto presented him with a sword, together with an embroidered belt, on which these words were wrought in letters of gold. He is the right valiant Cornish man who slew the giant Cormelian. Footnote. Giant Cormelian is an alternative named in 18th century text Cormelian, Cormoran, and Corinoran, possibly the Corinius of Geoffrey of Monmouth. End footnote. The news of Jack's victory was soon spread over the western part, so that another giant named Blunderbore, hearing of it, vowed to be revenged on Jack, even if it ever was his fortune to light on him. This giant kept an enchanted castle, situated in the midst of a lonesome wood. Now Jack, about 4 months off, walking by the borders of the same place, in his journey towards Wales, he grew weary, and therefore sat himself down by the side of a pleasant fountain, where a deep sleep suddenly seized him, at which time the giant coming there for water found him, and by the lines written upon his belt knew him to be Jack, who killed his brother giant, and therefore, without making any words, he snatches him upon his shoulder for to carry him home to his enchanted castle. Now as they passed through a thicket, the rustling of the boughs awakened Jack, who, finding himself in the clutches of the giant, he was strangely surprised, but it was the beginning of his terror, for entering within the first walls of the castle, he beheld the ground covered with bones and skulls of dead men, the giant telling Jack that his bones would enlarge the number of what he see there. This said, he brought him into a large parlour. There he beheld the bloody quarters of some that were lately slain. And in the next room were hearts and livers, which the giant, to terrify Jack, told him that men's heart was the choicest of his diet, for he commonly, as he said, eat them with pepper and vinegar, adding that he did not question that, but his heart would make him a dainty bit. This said, he locks poor Jack into an upper room, leaving him there while he went to fetch another giant, living in the same wood, that he might partake of the pleasure that they should have in the destruction of poor Jack. Now while he was gone, dreadful shrieks and cries affrighted poor Jack, especially a voice which continually cried, Do what you can to get away, or you'll become the giant's prey. He's gone to fetch his brother, who will kill and likewise torture you. This dreadful noise so amazed poor Jack that he was ready to run distracted. Then going to a window, he opened a casement where he beheld afar off the two giants coming together. Now quoth Jack to himself, "My death or deliverance is at hand." There were strong cords in the room by him, of which he makes two, at the ends of which he makes a noose. And while the giant was unlocking the iron gate, he threw the ropes over their heads, and drew the other end across a beam, which he pulled with all his main strength till he had throttled them. And then fastening the ropes to the beam, he returned to the window, where he beheld the two giants black in the face. Then sliding down by the rope, he came to their heads, where the helpless giants could not defend themselves, and drawing out his sword, slew them both, and delivered himself from their intended cruelty. Then taking the keys, he entered the castle, where upon strict search he found 3 fair ladies, tied by the hair of the head, almost starved to death, who told Jack that their husbands had been slain by the giant, and that they were kept many days without food, and in order to feed upon the flesh of their murdered husbands, which they could not, if they were to starve to death. "Sweet ladies," quoth Jack, "I have destroyed the monster with his brutish brother, by which I obtained your liberties." This said, he presented them with the keys of the castle, and so proceeded for his journey in Wales. Jack, having but little money, thought it prudent to make the best of his way by travelling hard, and at length losing his road was belated, and could not get to a place of entertainment. Still, coming to a valley placed between 2 hills, he found a large house in that lonesome place, and by reason of his present necessity, he took courage to knock at the gate, where, to his amazement, there came forth a monstrous giant with 2 heads. Yet he did not seem to be so fiery as the others had been, for he was a Welsh giant, and what he did was by private and secret malice, under the false shoe of friendship. For Jack, telling his condition, he bid him welcome, shewing him a room with a bed in it, where he might take his night's repose. Whereupon Jack undresses, and as the giant was walking away to another apartment, Jack heard him mutter these words to himself: "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." "Say'st thou so?" quoth Jack. "That's like one of your Welsh tricks, yet I hope to be cunning enough for you." Then getting out of his bed and feeling about in the dark, he found a thick billet, which he laid in the bed in his stead, and laid himself in a dark corner of the room, where in the dead of night came the Welsh giant with his club, and struck several heavy blows upon his bed, where Jack had laid the billet, and then returned to his chamber, supposing he had broken all the bones in his skin. The next morning Jack came to give him thanks for his lodging. Quoth the giant, "How have you rested? Did you not feel something in the night?" "No, nothing," quoth Jack, "but a rat, which gave me 3 or 4 slaps with her tail." Soon after the giant arose and went to his breakfast with a bowl of hasty pudding, containing 4 gallons, giving Jack the like quantity, who, being loth to let the giant know he could not eat with him, got a large leathern bag, putting it artificially under his loose coat, into which he secretly conveyed the pudding, telling the giant he would shew him a trick, and then taking a large knife, ripped open the bag, which the giant supposed to be his belly, and out came the hasty pudding, which the giant, seeing, cried out, "Cosblood, her can do that trick herself." Then taking his sharp knife, he ripped open his own belly from the bottom to the top, and out dropped his tripes and trolley-bubs, so that her fell on down dead. And thus Jack outwitted the Welsh giant, and proceeded forward on his journey. King Arthur's son desired of his father to furnish him with a certain sum of money, that he might go to seek his fortune in the Principality of Wales, where a beautiful lady lived, whom he heard was possessed with 7 evil spirits. The king, his father, counselled him against it, yet he would not be persuaded from it, so that he granted what he requested, which was 1 horse loaded with money, with another for himself to ride on. Thus he went forth without any attendants, and after several days' travel he came to a market town in Wales, where he beheld a vast concourse of people gathered there. The king's son demanded the reason of it, and was told that they had arrested a corps for many large sums of money, which the deceased owed when he died. The king's son replied, "It is a pity that creditors should be so cruel." "Go bury the dead," said he, "and let his creditors come along to my lodging, and their debts shall be discharged." Accordingly they came, and in such great numbers that before night he had almost left himself penniless. Now Jack the giant killer being there, and seeing the generosity of the king's son, he was highly taken with him, and desired to be his servant. It was agreed upon, and the next morning they set forward, when riding out at the town's end, an old woman called after him, crying out, "He has owed me 2 pence this 7 years, pray, sir, pay me as well as the rest." He put his hand in his pocket and gave it to her, being the last he had left. Then the king's son, turning to Jack, said, "I cannot tell how to subsist in my intended journey." "For that," quoth Jack, "take you no thought, no care, let me alone, we will not want." Now Jack had a small spill in his pocket, and at noon it served to give them a refreshment, which done they had not a penny left between them. The afternoon they spent in travel and familiar discourse, till the sun began to grow low, at which time the king's son said, "Jack, since we have no money, where can we think to lodge this night?" Jack replied, "Master, we will do well enough, for I have an uncle who lives within 2 miles of this place. He is a huge and monstrous giant with 3 heads. He'll fight 500 men in armor, and make them flee before him." "Alas," quoth the king's son, "what should we do there? He'll certainly chop us up in a mouthful. Nay, we are scarcely enough to fill one of his hollow teeth." "It is no matter for that," quoth Jack. "I myself will go before and prepare the way for you. Therefore tarry and wait my return." He waits, and Jack rides full speed. When coming to the gate of the castle, he knocked with that force which made the neighboring hills resound. The giant, with a voice like thunder, roared out, "Who is there?" He was answered, "None but your poor cousin Jack." Quoth he, "What news with my poor cousin Jack?" He replied, "Dear uncle, heavy news God wot. Prithee, what heavy news can come to me? I am a giant, and with 3 heads, and besides thou knowest I can fight 500 men in armor, and make them fly like chaff before the wind." "Oh, but," quoth Jack, "here is a king's son coming with 1,000 men in armor to kill you, and destroy all that you have." "Oh, cousin Jack, that is heavy news indeed. I have a large vault under the ground, where I will immediately run and hide myself, and thou shalt lock, bolt, and bar me in, and keep the keys till the king's son is gone." Now Jack, having secured the giant, he returns and fetches his master, and both heartily merrily with wine, and of the dainties which the house afforded. That night they rested in a pleasant lodgings, while the poor giant lay trembling in a vault under the ground. In the morning Jack furnished his master with a fresh supply of gold and silver, and then set him 3 miles forward of his journey, concluding he was then pretty well out of the smell of the giant, and then returned and let his uncle out of his hole, who asked Jack what he should give him for his care, in regard to see his castle was not demolished. "Why," quoth Jack, "I desire nothing but the old rusty sword, coat, and slippers, which are at your bed's head." Quoth the giant, "Thou shalt have them, and prithee keep them for my sake, for they are things of excellent use. The coat will keep you invisible, the cap will furnish you with knowledge, the sword will come out, and the sword will cut in sunder whatever you may strike. The shoes are of extraordinary swiftness, they may be serviceable to you, and therefore take them with all my heart." Jack takes them, and so follows his master. Jack having overtaken his master, they soon arrived at the lady's house, and finding the king's son to be a suitor, prepared a banquet for him, which being ended, she wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, saying, "You must show me this tomorrow morning, or else lose your head," and with that put it into her bosom. The king's son went to bed right sorrowful, but Jack's cap of knowledge instructed him how to obtain it. In the middle of the night, she calls upon her familiar to carry her to Lucifer. Jack whipped on his coat of darkness, with his shoes of swiftness, and was there before her, for by reason of his coat they could not see him. When she entered, he gave the handkerchief to Lucifer, who laid it upon a shelf, from whence Jack took it and brought it to his master, who, shewing it to the lady the next day, saved his life. The next night she saluted the young prince, telling him he must show her the lips tomorrow morning that she kissed his last this night, or lose his head. He replied, "If you kissed none but mine, I will." "'Tis neither here nor there," said she. "If you do not, death is your portion." At midnight she went as before, and was angry with Lucifer for letting the handkerchief go. "But now," she said, "I shall be too hard for the young prince, for I will kiss thy lips," which she did. Jack, standing by with his sword of sharpness, cut off the devil's head, and brought it under his invisible coat to his master, who laid it at the end of his bolster, and in the morning when she came up, he pulled it out by the horns, and shewed her the devil's lips, which she kissed last. Thus, having answered her twice, the enchantment broke, and the evil spirit left her, at which time she appeared in all her beauty, a sweet and virtuous creature. They were married the next morning, and soon after returned with joy to the court of King Arthur, when Jack, for his good service, was made one of the Knights of the Round Table. The second part of Jack and the Giants. Jack, having been successful in all his undertakings, and resolving not to be idle for the future, but to perform what service he could for the honour of his king and country, he humbly requested the king his master to fit him forth with a horse and money to travel in search of strange and new adventures. For, saith he, there are many giants yet living in the remote parts of this kingdom, and the dominion of Wales, due the unspeakable damage of your majesty's liege subjects, wherefore may it please you to give me encouragement, and I doubt not in a short time to cut them off root and branch, and so rid the realm of those cruel giants and devouring monsters in nature. Now when the king had heard his noble propositions, and had duly considered the mischievous practices of those bloodthirsty giants, he immediately granted what honest Jack requested, and on the first day of March, being thoroughly furnished with all necessities for his progress, he took his leave, not only of King Arthur, but likewise of all the trusty and hardy knights belonging to the Round Table, who after much satisfaction and friendly greeting, parted, the king and nobles to their country palace, and Jack, the giant killer, to the eager pursuit of fortune's favour, taking with him the cap of knowledge, sword of sharpness, shoes of swiftness, and likewise the invisible coat, that better to perfect and complete the dangerous enterprises that lay before him. Jack travelled over vast hills and mountains, when at the end of 3 days he came to a large and spacious wood, through which he must needs pass, where, all on a sudden, to his amazement, he heard dreadful shrieks and cries, whereupon, casting his eyes around to observe what it might be, beheld a giant, with a worthy knight and his lady, whom he held by the hair of their heads in his hands, with as much ease as if they had been but a pair of gloves, the sight of which melted honest Jack in tears of pity and compassion. Wherefore, alighting from his horse, which he left tied to an oak tree, and then putting on his invisible coat, under which he carried his infallible sword, he came up to the giant, and though he made several passes at him, yet nevertheless it could not reach the trunk of his body, by reason of his height, though he wounded his thighs in several places. But at length, giving him with both hands a swinging stroke, cut off both his legs, just below the knee, so that the trunk of his body made not only the ground to shake, but likewise the trees to tremble with the force of his fall, at which, by near fortune, the knight and his fair lady escaped his rage. Then had Jack time to talk with him, setting his foot on his neck, saying, Thou savage and barbarous wretch, I am come to execute upon you the just reward of your villainy. And with that, running him through and through, the monster sent forth a hideous groan, and so yielded up his life into the hands of the valiant conqueror Jack the giant killer, while the noble knight and virtuous lady were both joyful spectators of his sudden downfall and their own deliverance. This being done, the courteous knight and his fair lady not only returned to him hearty thanks for their deliverance, but also invited him home, there to refresh himself after the dreadful encounter, as likewise to receive some reward by way of gratitude for his good service. I cannot, says Jack, be at ease until I find out the den which was this monster's habitation. The knight, hearing this, waxed right sorrowful, and replied, Noble stranger, it is too much to run a second hazard. For note, this monster lived in a den under yonder mountain, with a brother of his, more fierce and fell than himself, and therefore, if you should go thither, and perish in the attempt, it would be the heart-breaking both of me and my lady. Therefore, let me persuade you to go with us, and desist from any further pursuit. Nay, quoth Jack, if there be another, say, were there 20, I would shed the last drop of blood in my body, before one of them should escape my fury, and when I have finished this task, I will come and pay my respects to you. So taking direction to their habitation, he mounted his horse, leaving them to return home, while he went in pursuit of the deceased giant's brother. Jack had not rid past 1.5 miles before he came in sight of the cave's mouth, near to the centre of which he beheld the other giant, sitting upon a huge block of timber, with a knotted iron club lying by his side, waiting, as he supposed, for his brother's return with his barbarous prey, his goggling eyes appearing like terrible flames of fire, his countenance grim and ugly, for his cheeks appeared like a couple of large flitches of bacon. Moreover, the bristles of his beard seemed to resemble rods of iron wire, His locks hung down upon his brawny broad shoulders like curled snakes or hissing adders. Jack alighted from his horse and put him into a thicket. Then with his coat of darkness he approached something nearer to behold this figure, and said softly, "Oh, are you there? It will not be long ere I take you by the beard." The giant all this while could not see him by reason of his invisible coat, so that coming up close to him, valiant Jack, fetching a blow at his head with his sword of sharpness, and missing something of his aim, cut off the giant's nose, whose nostrils were wider than a pair of Jack's boots. The pain was terrible, and so he put up his hands to feel for his nose, and when he could not find it, he raved and roared louder than claps of thunder. And though he turned up his glaring eyes, he could not see from whence the blow came, which had done him that great diskindness. Yet, nevertheless, he took up his iron-knotted club and began to lay about him like one that was stark staring mad. "Nay," quoth Jack, "if you are for that sport, then I will dispatch you quickly, for fear an accidental blow fall." Then, as the giant rose from his block, Jack makes no more to do, but runs his sword up to the hilt in the giant's fundament, where he left it sticking for a while, and stood himself laughing, with his hands at akimbo, to see the giant caper and dance the canaries, with a sword in his arse, crying out, he should die, with a griping of the guts. Canaries, footnote, was a lively Spanish dance popular in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, end footnote. Thus did the giant continue raving for an hour or more, and at length fell down dead, whose dreadful fall had like to have crushed poor Jack, had he not been nimble to avoid the same. This being done, Jack cut off both the giants' heads, and sent them to King Arthur by a waggoner, which he hired for the same purpose, together with an account of his prosperous success in all his undertakings. Jack, having thus dispatched these two monsters, resolved to enter the cave in search of the giant's treasure. He passed along through many turnings and windings, which led him at length to a room paved with freestone, at the upper end of which was a boiling cauldron, and on the right hand stood a large table, where he supposed the giants used to dine. Then he came to an iron gate, where there was a window secured with bars of iron, through which he looked, and there beheld a vast many miserable captives, who, seeing Jack at a distance, cried out with a loud voice, "Alas! Young man, art thou come to be one among us in this miserable den?" "Aye," quoth Jack, "I hope I shall not tarry long here, but pray tell me what's the meaning of your captivity." "Why," said one, "young man, I'll tell you. We are persons that have been taken by the giants that kept this cave, and here are kept till such time as they have occasion for a feast more than ordinary, and that the fattest among us is slaughtered and prepared for their devouring jaws. It is not long since they took 3 for the same purpose, nay, many are the times they have dined on murdered men." "Say you so?" quoth Jack. "Well, I have gave them both such a dinner, that it will be long enough, ere they'll have occasion for any more." The miserable captives were amazed at his words. "You may believe me," quoth Jack, "for I have slain them with the point of my sword, and as for their monstrous heads, I sent them in a waggon to the court of King Arthur, as trophies of my unparalleled victories." And for testimony of the truth, he said, he unlocked the iron gate, setting the miserable captives at liberty, who all rejoiced like condemned malefactors, at the sight of a reprieve. Then, leading them all together to the aforesaid room, he placed them round the table, and set before them 2 quarters of beef, also bread and wine, so that he feasted them very plentifully. Supper being ended, they searched the giant's coffers, where, finding a vast store of gold and silver, Jack equally divided it amongst them. They all returned him hearty thanks for their treasure and miraculous deliverance. That night they went to their rest, and in the morning they arose and departed, the captives to their respective towns and places of abode, and Jack to the knight's house, whom he had formerly delivered from the hands of the giants. It was about sunrising when Jack mounted his horse to proceed on his journey, and by the help of his directions he came to the knight's house, something before noon, where he was received with all demonstration of joy imaginable by the knight and his lady, who in honourable respect to Jack prepared a feast, which lasted many days, inviting all the gentry in the adjacent parts, to whom the worthy knight was pleased to relate the manner of his former danger and miraculous deliverance by the undaunted courage of Jack the Giant Killer, and by way of gratitude he presented him with a ring of gold on which was engraved by curious art the picture of the giant dragging a distressed knight and his fair lady by the hair of the head, with this motto: "We are in sad distress, you see, under a giant's fierce command. but gained our lives and liberty by valiant Jack's victorious hand. Now amongst the vast assembly then present was 5 aged gentlemen, who were fathers to some of those miserable captives, which Jack had lately set at liberty, who, understanding that he was the person who had performed such miraculous wonders, they immediately paid their venerable respects, after which their mirth increased, and the smiling bowls went freely round to the prosperous success of the victorious conqueror. But, see, in the midst of all this mirth, a dark cloud appeared, which daunted the hearts of this honourable assembly, and thus it was, a messenger came, and brought the dismal tidings of the approach of one Thunderdell, a huge giant with 2 heads, who, having heard of the death of his 2 kinsmen, the 2 giants aforesaid, was come from northern Wales in search after Jack, to be revenged of him for their miserable downfall, and was within a mile of the knight's house, the country people flying before him from their houses and habitations like chaff before the wind. When they had related this, Jack, not a whit daunted, said, "Let him come. I am prepared with a tool to pick his teeth. And you, gentlemen and ladies, walk but forth into the garden, and you shall be the joyful spectators of this monstrous giant's death and destruction." To which they consented, every one wishing him good fortunes in that dangerous enterprise. The situation of the knight's house take as follows. It was placed in the midst of a small island, encompassed round with a vast moat, 30 foot deep and 20 foot wide, over which lay a drawbridge, whereof Jack employed 2 men to cut it on both sides, almost to the middle, and then dressing himself in his coat of darkness, likewise putting on his shoes of swiftness, he marches forth against the giant with his sword of sharpness, ready drawn. Yet when he came close up to him, the giant could not see Jack by reason of his invisible coat, which he had on, yet nevertheless he was sensible of some approaching danger, which made him cry out these following words: "Fee, foul, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." Footnote. Just one moment. All right, my apologies for that. Footnote. Numerous versions of fee fo fum come, perhaps the most famous war cry in English literature. For example, fee fa fum, I smell the blood of an earthly man. Let him be alive or dead, off goes his head. And fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. If he have any liver and lights, I'll have them for my supper tonight. The formula is common to most British tales of blood-loving giants, including that of Red Eton, the uncouth Scottish monster, with the 3 Hydis, who was apparently well known in former times, referred to in 1528, and who seems to have made his entrance invariably with the welcoming words, "Snook but and snook ben, I find the smell of an earthly man. Be he living or be he dead, his heart this night shall kitchen my bread." See also the foreknote to this tale. End footnote. "Sayest thou so?" quoth Jack. "Then thou art a monstrous miller indeed. But how? If I should serve thee as I did the 2 giants of late, in my conscience I should spoil your practice for the future." "Art thou that villain which destroyed my 2 kinsmen? Then I will..." At which time the giant spoke out with a voice like roaring thunder. "Art thou the villain which destroyed my 2 kinsmen? Then I will tear thee with my teeth, suck thy blood, and what is more, I'll grind thy bones to powder." "You will catch me first," quoth Jack, and with that threw off his coat of darkness that the giant might see him clearly, and then run from him, as if through fear. The giant, with foaming mouth and glaring eyes, followed after, like a walking castle, making the foundation of the earth, as it were, to shake at every step. Jack led him a dance 3 or 4 times round the moat belonging to the knight's house, that the gentlemen and ladies might take a full view of this huge monster in nature, who followed Jack with all his might, but could not overtake him by reason of his shoes of swiftness, which carried him faster than the giant could follow. At length, Jack, to finish the work, took over the bridge, the giant pursuing him with his iron club upon his shoulder, but, coming to the middle of the drawbridge, that, with the weight of his body, and the dreadful steps that he took, broke down, and he tumbled souse into the water, where he roared and wallowed like a whale. Jack, standing upon the side of the wharf, laughed at the giant and said, "You would grind my bones to powder. Here you have water enough. Pray, where is your mill?" The giant fretted and fumed to hear him scoff at that rate, and though he plunged from place to place in the moat, yet could not get out to be revenged on his adversary. Jack at length got a cart rope and cast it over the giant's 2 heads with a slip knot, and by the help of a team of horses, dragged him out again, with which he was near strangled. And before he would let him loose, he cut off both his heads with his sword of sharpness, in the full view of all the worthy assembly of knights, gentlemen, and ladies, who gave a joyful shout when they saw the giant fairly dispatched. Then before he would either eat or drink, he sent his heads also after the other to the court of King Arthur, which being done, Jack, with the ladies, returned to their mirth and pastime, which lasted for many days. After some time spent in triumph, mirth, and pastime, Jack grew weary of riotous living, wherefore, taking his leave of the knights and ladies, he set forward in search of new adventures. Through many woods and groves he passed, meeting with nothing remarkable, till at length, coming near the foot of a high mountain, late at night, he knocked at the door of a lonesome house, at which time an ancient man, with a head as white as snow, arose and let him in. "Father," said Jack, "have you any entertainment for a benighted traveller that has lost his way?" "Yes," said the old man, "if you will accept of such commendations as my poor cottage will afford, thou shalt be right welcome." Jack returned him many thanks for his civility, therefore down they sat together, and the old man began to discourse him as follows. "Son," said he, "I am sensible that thou art the great conqueror of giants, and it lies in thy power to free this part of the country from an intolerable burden which we groan under. For behold, my son, on top of this high mountain there is an enchanted castle, kept by a huge and monstrous giant, named Galligantus, who by the help of an old conjurer betrays many knights and ladies in his strong castle, where by magic art they are transformed into sundry shapes and forms. But above all I lament the miserable misfortune of a duke's daughter, whom they fetched from her father's garden by magic art, and brought her through the air in a mourning chariot, drawn as it were by 2 fiery dragons, and having secured her within the walls of the castle, she was immediately transformed into the shape of a white hind, where she miserably mounted her misfortune. And though many worthy knights have endeavoured to break the enchantment and work her deliverance, yet none of them could accomplish this great work by reason of 2 dreadful griffins, who are fixed by magic art at the entrance of the castle gate, which destroyed them at the first approach, so soon as they had fixed their eyes upon them. But you, my son, being furnished with an invisible coat, may pass by them undiscovered, where on the brazen gates of the castle you shall find it engraved in large characters, by what means the enchantment may be broken." The old man having ended his discourse, Jack gave him his hand, with a faithful promise that in the morning he would venture his life for the breaking of the enchantment, and freeing the lady, together with the rest that were miserable partners in her calamity. Having refreshed themselves with a small morsel of meat, they lay down to rest, and in the morning Jack arose, and put on his invisible coat, cap of knowledge, and shoes of swiftness, and so prepares him for the dangerous enterprise. Now when he had ascended up to the top of the mountain, he discovered the 2 fiery griffins. He passed on between them without any fear, for they could not see him by reason of his invisible coat. Now when he was got beyond them, he cast his eyes around him, where he found upon the gates a golden trumpet, hung in a chain of fine silver, under which these lines were engraved. "Whoever shall this trumpet blow shall soon the giant overthrow, and break the black enchantment straight, so shall all be in happy state." Jack had no sooner read this inscription, but he blew the trumpet, at which time the vast foundation of the castle trembled, and the giant, together with the conjurer, was in a horrid confusion, biting their thumbs and tearing their hair, knowing their wicked reign was at an end, at which time Jack, standing at the giant's elbow, as he was stooping to take up his club, at one blow with his sword of sharpness cut off his head. The conjurer, seeing this, mounted immediately in the air, and was carried away in a whirlwind. Thus was the whole enchantment broke, and every knight and lady that had been for a long time transformed into birds and beasts returned to their proper shapes and likenesses again. And as for the castle, though it seemed at first to be a vast place of strength and bigness, it vanished away like a cloud of smoke, whereupon a universal joy appeared amongst the released knights and ladies. This being done, the head of Galligantus was likewise, according to his customed manner, conveyed to the court of King Arthur as present to the king. The very next day, having refreshed the knights and ladies at the old man's habitation, who lived at the foot of the mountain, he set forward for the court of King Arthur, with those knights and ladies which he had so honourably delivered. When coming to the king, and having related all the passages of his fierce encounters, his fame rung through the whole court, and as a reward of his good service, the king prevailed with the aforesaid duke to bestow his daughter in marriage on honest Jack, protesting that there was no man living so worthy of her as he, all which the duke very honourably consented to. So married they were, and not only the court, but likewise the kingdom was filled with joy and triumph at the wedding, after which the king, as a reward for all his good services done for his nation, bestowed upon him a noble habitation, with a very plentiful estate thereunto belonging, where he and his lady lived the residue of their days in great joy and happiness. The end. Next up, The Yellow Dwarf will be the next story that I will read. Good morning to you all.